Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Let's just jump right in, shall we? That's the only way to do this. As Chris said, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Bite one starts on page 1. Quote, "The Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion." Quote, "The special counsel's investigation established that Russia interfered in the 2016 presidential election principally through 2 operations. First, a Russian entity carried out a social media campaign that favored presidential candidate Donald J. Trump and disparaged presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. Second, a Russian intelligence service conducted computer intrusion operations against entities, employees, and volunteers working on the Clinton campaign, and then released stolen documents. The investigation also identified numerous links between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. The investigation established that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome, and that the campaign expected it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts. In terms of how the Russians did what they did and why they did it precisely the way they did it, this part right at the start of the report stands out to me still like it is written in light in the night sky. The Internet Research Agency, IRA, carried out the earliest Russian interference operations identified by the investigation. A social media campaign designed to provoke and amplify political and social discord in the United States. The IRA used social media accounts and interest groups to sow discord in the U.S. political system through what it termed information warfare. The campaign evolved from a generalized program designed in 2014 and 2015 to undermine the U.S. electoral system to a targeted operation that by early 2016 favored candidate Trump and disparaged candidate Clinton. Okay, just think about that evolution for a second. Think about what Russia's doing and why they did it. I mean, why was Russia bothering to do this? We now know from this unredacted part of Mueller's report that Russia doesn't start out trying to figure out a way to make Donald Trump president. That's not their project here. They start out trying to sow discord in the U.S. political system. They start out trying to undermine the U.S. electoral system. They are trying to hurt the United States in those specific ways. And somehow that evolves seamlessly into Russia trying to help candidate Donald Trump get elected president. Why were those two things on the same continuum, according to the Russian government? I mean, what the Mueller report spells out today from page 1 is that Russia started off with a plan to hurt America, to undermine American democracy. I mean, including sending employees from this internet troll farm over to the United States as early as mid-2014 on an intelligence gathering mission in the United States. Donald Trump was nowhere near any presidential politics in 2014. But they already literally had operatives here on an intel gathering mission for this ongoing Russian effort. The Russian government was already working on this years-long effort to try to hurt us, to try to somehow specifically infect and rot our electoral system and faith in U.S. democracy. And they started working on it, 2014. Then they get their vehicle to glom that ongoing operation onto. And that vehicle is the candidacy of Donald J. Trump. Quote, by February 2016, internal IRA documents referred to support for the Trump campaign. As early as March 2016, they are purchasing online ads that overtly opposed the Clinton campaign. Quote, for example, on March 18th, 2016, the IRA purchased an advertisement depicting candidate Clinton and a caption that read, in part, if one day God lets this liar enter the White House as president, that day would be a real national tragedy. At the same time, they go all in for Trump. Quote, the first known IRA advertisement explicitly endorsing the Trump campaign was purchased April 19th, 2016. The IRA bought an advertisement for its Instagram account, Tea Party News, asking U.S. persons to help them make a patriotic team of young Trump supporters by uploading photos with the hashtag #KidsForTrump. It was Russia who was trying to get the hashtag #KidsForTrump trending, using their Tea Party fake online avatars, which were actually operated from St. Petersburg in Russia. because that hashtag Kids for Trump, that was the spring 2016 evolution of the overall long-running, by that point, years-long running effort to do whatever they could to try to destroy American democracy. Why did they think supporting candidate Donald Trump would do that? I mean, Russia presumably is not trying to make America great again. Right? They are running an ongoing op that well preceded the Trump effort to try to weaken us as much as they can. When Trump came along, they decided Trump was the perfect vehicle to continue and expand that work. How come? We learned from Robert Mueller's report today a few things that were total surprises, at least to me. We learned from Mueller's report today that it was not just the Internet Research Agency, this online troll farm that was doing all the online propaganda and social media stuff. Mueller says they obtained evidence that it was other Russian entities that were also running similar active measures campaigns to try to help Trump win and to try to hurt Hillary Clinton's chances. Oddly, they say, quote, this office, meaning the special counsel's office, has shared that evidence with other offices of the Department of Justice and the FBI. What other offices? Is somebody else working on that now? Other entities in Russia besides the Internet Research Agency that were doing this social media and online and propaganda and disinformation stuff to try to infect the U.S. government, the U.S. election on behalf of the Russian Federation to benefit Trump? There were other Russian entities doing that part of it? Apparently, and those things have been referred to other entities in the FBI and the Justice Department. Who are they? What are they investigating? What does that relate to? That's actually a surprisingly recurring theme throughout the Mueller report. I mean, we're going to talk tonight about the 12 cases that Mueller has referred for prosecution, referred to other law enforcement entities for prosecution. 12 of the 14 of them are totally blacked out in this report. We're not allowed to know who those entities are or if they are yet being prosecuted or by whom. We just know that those dozen cases have been referred by Mueller for potential prosecution. Who are those? We'll also talk about the 2 active cases that Mueller apparently started prosecuting that have now been handed off to other prosecutors, but those are cases where we don't know who the defendants are. I mean, there's this big, long list in the report of all the cases we know about that Mueller has handed off, right? Manafort, Flynn, Gates, Bijan Kian, Roger Stone, the GRU case, Sam Patton, Konstantin Kilimnik, this big, long list. But then there's these other 2 cases that Mueller has handed off, not referred them for prosecution, but transferred the handling of those extant investigations and prosecutions to other law enforcement entities. But those extant cases, they're redacted. We don't know who they are. We'll talk about that a little more this hour in terms of figuring out what exactly is the scale of what the special counsel has been doing here. But check this out, too. I mean, here's a whole nother category of information Mueller appears to have developed in this investigation that is also somewhere else at this point. Quote, for more than the past year, the FBI embedded personnel at the special counsel's office who did not work on the special counsel's investigation, but whose purpose was to review the results of the investigation and to send, in writing, summaries of foreign intelligence and counterintelligence information to FBI headquarters and FBI field offices. Those communications and other correspondence between the special counsel's office and the FBI contain information derived from the investigation, not all of which is contained in this volume. In other words, hey, intelligence committees, come and get it. All of the foreign intelligence and counterintelligence stuff that has been turned up in this investigation that is not in this report, we've had FBI agents operating in this office, committing all that stuff, in writing it, conveying it to other elements of U.S. law enforcement and counterintelligence work, and that's not here, but we're letting you know that exists so that you can go get it. Okay. We saw Adam Schiff and other members of the intelligence committees asking how the counterintelligence part of this investigation would be handled in terms of this public-facing report. Now we know at least a categorical designation of that evidence. They just didn't put in here. But they let us know that it exists so that the intelligence committees, presumably, can go and obtain it. I mean, that said, there is a ton of material here. There's so much more here than I thought we would get. I mean, just like scraping the surface, just top of my head, not even the most important stuff. But we finally get the explanation for the whole Peter Smith story. You remember that story? The guy who killed himself, Republican activist who killed himself shortly after telling a reporter for the Wall Street Journal that he had been contacting hackers online to try to get Hillary Clinton's emails to benefit the Trump campaign. Turns out that effort, according to the special counsel's office, that effort by Peter Smith actually started with a request from Donald Trump himself. He requested to members of his campaign that they needed to figure out ways to find Clinton's emails. Soon-to-be National Security Advisor Mike Flynn took that request from Donald Trump himself and pitched that request to Peter Smith. And that's how that whole effort started, which ended with Smith's suicide. It also turns out that the Trump Tower meeting offer to give the Trump campaign dirt on Hillary Clinton from Russian sources, turns out that was not the only offer of Russia-related dirt on Hillary Clinton. Turns out Jared Kushner also fielded another previously unreported offer of Russia-related Hillary Clinton dirt from yet another source, this time at a meeting in his New York office in August 2016. Turns out Jared Kushner also had an American friend of his sit down with a representative from Vladimir Putin's office, whereupon the two of them wrote up a plan that would result in dropping sanctions on Russia. They gave this plan to Jared Kushner. He received it, and then he received it from his friend who was working with Putin's guy, and Jared then personally delivered it both to the White House and to the U.S. State Department. Because sure, that's how that kind of material should be handled. We also got a national security horror movie plot when it comes to Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort, who is currently serving a federal prison sentence. In the report, we learned that Trump hired as his campaign chairman a man who by then had spent more than a decade working to provide, quote, political risk insurance for a Russian oligarch close to Vladimir Putin. The oligarch, Oleg Deripaska, quote, used Manafort to install friendly political officials in countries where Deripaska had business interests. Manafort's job for more than a decade, before he started working for Trump, was that he installed friendly political officials in office on behalf of a Kremlin-connected oligarch. The oligarch paid him to install people in high office in foreign countries for the convenience of the Kremlin. That was Donald Trump's campaign chair. And incidentally, that Associated Press story from the spring of 2017 turns out to be right. The explicit terms of Manafort's arrangement with this oligarch, quote, referenced the need to brief the Kremlin and referenced the benefits that the work could confer on the Putin government. Oh, the benefits for the Putin government, they need to be kept fully apprised on Manafort's work to bring about those benefits by installing friendly officials in foreign countries. That's who Trump brought on to run his campaign. And we're going to be talking about this for a long while yet. There is a ton here. But, I mean, just for the purposes of tonight, you should know that Manafort did repeatedly send detailed internal polling data from the Trump campaign to a Russian guy who, it was understood, would also send that information to this Kremlin-connected oligarch. He repeatedly provided internal polling data to that Russian guy. At an in-person meeting in August 2016, Manafort provided this Russian intermediary, this Russian guy who was his intermediary with Deripaska. He was also a guy linked to Russian intelligence who was elsewhere described in Mueller's report today as acting on behalf of the Russian government. Manafort, in August 2016, provided him, in person, a briefing on the state of Trump's campaign, Manafort's specific plan as Trump's campaign chairman for how Trump could win the election, the Trump campaign's planned messaging for the end of the presidential campaign, yet more internal polling data from the Trump campaign, although he'd been feeding him that for months, plus, quote, a discussion of battleground states, which Manafort identified to his Russian contact, again in August 2016, as Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. So Manafort, according to Mueller, repeatedly lied, including to prosecutors with whom he had entered into a plea agreement, repeatedly lied about his contacts with that Russian guy who was his intermediary with the oligarch. He repeatedly lied about his contacts with him, repeatedly lied about what he gave that guy from Trump's campaign, repeatedly lied about their ongoing work and discussions on yet another plan that would result in the U.S. dropping sanctions against Putin's government. because Mueller's team was unable to rely on anything that Manafort told them because he was constantly lying to them. And without them being able to access many of Manafort's communications, many of which were sent via encrypted applications, without them being able to track what happened to that valuable campaign information that Manafort sent to his Russian contact, with the understanding that he would send it on to this Kremlin-connected oligarch. Without the ability to follow this to its ends, the special counsel say they come to no conclusions as to what happened with all that stuff that Trump's campaign chair sent over to Russia, and whether or not that stuff really was a help or not in Russia's then vociferous and robust efforts to help Trump target and turn out his voters and to target and suppress Hillary Clinton's voters. So, I mean, like I said, we're just scratching the surface here. If nothing else ever happens in the news in the next year, I will be busy for the next year, at least. I mean, these 448 still redacted pages that we got today, it's like walking into a vineyard and you just like eat the skin off a single grape. Like, honestly, we could spend a week here just on what happened with Eric Prince and Steve Bannon and how it is that either of them has thus far avoided being charged. But honestly, the real shock of what we got today. So Volume 1 is about the Russian interference in the election and the contacts, the myriad and many previously unexplained contacts between Russian individuals and people associated with the Trump campaign. That's Volume 1. The shock of what we got today, I think, is Volume 2. It's the 182-page-long case, essentially, that the special counsel laid out for charging the President of the United States with obstruction of justice. And honestly, that's what it is. That's what Volume 2 of this report is. It's a roadmap for how to charge this president with multiple felony counts of obstruction of justice. Contrary to the direct assertions from Attorney General William Barr, the special counsel didn't just inexplicably decide that they weren't going to decide whether the president criminally obstructed justice. It is amazing that William Barr lied about that so many times and so blatantly when, in this report, Mueller actually spells out exactly what he was doing about his charging decisions on obstruction. And it's not even in legalese. It's totally clear, blunt, understandable by those of us who are not lawyers. And it is a case that makes sense and that Barr lied about, that Barr presented to the public in a way diametrically opposite to what Mueller says here himself. Check it out. This is what Mueller actually says. Quote, "A traditional prosecution or declination decision entails a binary determination to initiate or decline a prosecution. But we determined not to make a traditional prosecutorial judgment when it came to obstruction of justice. The Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice has issued an opinion finding that the indictment or criminal prosecution of a sitting president would impermissibly undermine the capacity of the executive branch to perform its constitutionally assigned functions." So the OLC has a Justice Department policy which says you can't indict or prosecute a sitting president. Quote, "Given the role of the special counsel as an attorney in the Justice Department, given the framework of the special counsel regulations, this office accepted OLC's legal conclusion for the purpose of exercising prosecutorial jurisdiction." So, yeah, that's written by lawyers, but it's not legalese. Like, we can all get that, right? That's Mueller's office saying, hey, we recognize and we appreciate and we accept that we are bound by Justice Department policy. Justice Department policy, for good or for ill, it says you can't prosecute a sitting president. So because of that, because we accept that, we're constrained. We're constrained. We, in this report, can't say, okay, based on X conduct by the president, we believe he should be charged. They say, we feel constrained, we cannot do that. For one, they argue, and they say that would not be fair to the president. Quote, "Fairness concerns counseled against potentially reaching the judgment that the president committed crimes when no charges can be brought. The ordinary means for an individual to respond to an accusation is through a speedy and public trial, with all the procedural protections that surround a criminal case. An individual who believes he was wrongly accused can use that process to seek to clear his name. In contrast, a prosecutor's judgment that crimes were committed but that no charges will be brought affords no such adversarial opportunity for public name clearing before an impartial adjudicator." And that's a fair enough argument, right? What Mueller's saying here is in the normal course of events, prosecutor says you should be charged. you committed a crime. Well, if you shouldn't be charged, if you didn't commit a crime, if you dispute that, you can rebut that assertion from the prosecutors in court. That's the judicial system, right? You can go to court. You get your day in court, you get to disprove that allegation. But if it's not the normal course of events, because you're president, and Justice Department policy says you can't actually be prosecuted, well, in that case, if a prosecutor comes out and says you ought to be prosecuted, you committed a crime, well, you're never going to go to court. They're not going to actually prosecute you. And that means you'll never have a fair opportunity to rebut such an accusation. Right? It's a simple idea. If you can't be prosecuted, the prosecutors say you can't be accused of a crime by prosecutors either. That said, Mueller's office contends it's not like that means you get off scot-free. Quote, while the OLC opinion concludes that a sitting president may not be prosecuted, it recognizes that a criminal investigation during the president's term is permissible. We may not be able to prosecute you, but we can investigate you. Quote, the OLC opinion also recognizes that a president does not have immunity after he leaves office. So even if you can't be charged as president because you can't be prosecuted as president, we can darn sure investigate you, and you can darn sure be charged when you're out of office. You can darn well be charged based on the factual record that we turn up investigating you while you're in office. And then this to me is just remarkable. Quote, given those considerations, the facts known to us, and the strong public interest in safeguarding the integrity of the criminal justice system, we conducted a thorough factual investigation in order to preserve the evidence when memories were fresh and documentary materials were available. If we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, however, we are unable to reach that judgment. The evidence we obtained about the president's actions and intent presents difficult issues that prevent us from conclusively determining that no criminal conduct occurred. Accordingly, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also doesn't exonerate him. Which is just astonishing, right? I mean, this has happened. You'll always be able to say this happened in your lifetime. This is the special counsel saying, we are not allowed by Justice Department policy to say if the president committed crimes here. But we would tell you if we figured out that he didn't commit any crimes. Because we did a thorough examination here. If our thorough examination turned up a conclusion that the president committed no crimes, we would tell you that he committed no crimes. We're not in a position to say that. We can't tell you that, given what we turned up in our investigation. Now, we're not allowed to prosecute him now. He can be impeached. He can be prosecuted when he leaves office. But they say, here is the factual record of what he did and how all these multiple instances of obstruction of justice by the president basically fit the various predicates for prosecution. And then it's 180 pages of this stuff. In conclusion, at the end of Volume 2, they say our investigation found multiple acts by the president that were capable of exerting undue influence over law enforcement investigations, including the Russian interference and obstruction investigations. The incidents were often carried out through one-on-one meetings in which the president sought to use his official power outside of usual channels. These actions range from efforts to remove the special counsel and to reverse the effect of the attorney general's recusal, to the attempted use of official power to limit the scope of the investigation, to direct and indirect contacts with witnesses with the potential to influence their testimony. The president's efforts to influence the investigation were mostly unsuccessful, but that is largely because the persons who surrounded the president declined to carry out the orders or accede to his requests. Comey didn't end the investigation of Flynn, which ultimately resulted in Flynn's prosecution and conviction for lying to the FBI. McGahn didn't tell the acting attorney general that the special counsel must be removed, but was instead prepared to resign over the president's order. Lewandowski and Dearborn didn't deliver the president's message to Sessions that he should confine the Russia investigation to only future election meddling. McGahn refused to recede from his recollections about events surrounding the president's direction to have the special counsel removed, despite the president's multiple demands that he do so. Consistent with that pattern, the evidence we obtained would not support potential obstruction charges against the president's aides and associates beyond those already filed. And what is left tacit there is that the evidence they obtained would support potential obstruction charges against the president himself, if only he weren't the president. But they also note he won't be forever, and part of the way he could leave the presidency is via impeachment if Congress chose to follow this roadmap, where it quite obviously leads. Like I said, this is like grape one in the vineyard. There's a lot to get to, and we have some very, very special guests here tonight to help us get through it. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.